Hello, good afternoon everyone. My name's Shaun. I'm Agricultural Advisor at Affinity Water, and welcome to this session on multi-species cover crops. Got three really great speakers with me today. We've got Tom Sizmur from the University of Reading, Ian Gould from Oakbank, and Ian Waller, farmer from Hampton Bottom Farms. Is that right? Yeah. So as a water company, we're quite interested in cover crops, primarily from the value that cover crops provide to the soil, but also some cover crop mixes can be really good at capturing nitrate, and losses of nitrate into groundwater can be a big issue. So we've become really interested in cover crops, and we do fund farmers to grow cover crops in some of our catchments. But a topic that comes up often is, if you're just looking at a single issue like nitrate capture, it may lead you down a route of only going for one species. Brassicas obviously very good at holding on to nitrate, really effective at reducing nitrate leaching, but possibly missing a trick there by just focusing on one particular function of cover crops. So. We came up with this idea of a session today where we could explore a bit more detail around multi-species cover crops, why you should grow multi-species cover crops, what's the evidence of the benefits of growing multi-species cover crops, and any potential downfalls as well of growing multi-species cover crops. The session's going to run. I'm going to give each of the speakers 10-15 minutes to give a short presentation, and then we can open it out to the floor for any questions. So I'm going to start with Tom Sizmur. I'll just do a little introduction. Tom is an associate professor at the University of Reading, whose research focuses on the biogeochemistry of soils. Tom's interests particularly relate to the benefits that can be obtained from the incorporation of crop residues and other organic amendments into soils to recycle nutrients, feed soil organisms, and increase soil organic matter. So over to you, Tom.
Hi, thank you very much, Shaun, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm just going to start my presentation by talking about the principles of soil health. So I've taken these from the book by Gabe Brown. And we've got these 5 principles that he talks about in his book, talking about limiting disturbance, talking about armouring the soil surface, so using mulches, using living roots in the soil, and integrating animals within arable rotations. And then the 5th principle is all about building diversity. Now, I think the first 4 of these principles, there's shed loads of scientific literature out there that shows that the benefits that these can have for soil health, and particularly for increasing soil organic matter. But when we delve into the literature and we really look at the benefits that having plant diversity, the benefits that has on soil health or soil organic matter, that's a much less studied topic, and there's much less evidence out there about those benefits. So does diverse cover crop mixes or diverse plant mixtures increase soil organic matter? This is kind of something we've been looking at for the last few years and trying to answer. Or are there other sort of benefits that you get to soil health that derive from having a diverse mixture of cover crops? So one thing that is very kind of clear in the kind of ecology literature is this thing called the insurance hypothesis. So this is an idea that if you have multiple different species that are all trying to do the same job, then if you lose one of those species, then the function can still perform despite the fact that you've lost that one species due to some sort of perturbation event. And so this is a clear reason why if you're growing multiple species of cover crops, perhaps doing the same job, perhaps doing different jobs, that you might get a function, like a higher performing function, or more resilience against a kind of a shock event that you wouldn't get if you were growing kind of a single species. So, for example, by way of analogy, if I put a ball under one of 3 cups and move them around, if I gave you 1 guess, you'd have a 1 in 3 chance of finding that ball. If I give you 3 guesses, you'd be able to get that ball by the end of the 3rd guess. So it's kind of hedging your bets, basically, within farming. But as well as a diversity of plant materials, we've also got a diversity of functions that are performed by cover crops as well. So cover crops are helping to prevent nitrate leaching, as Shaun has mentioned. They're also helping to break pest and disease cycles. They're also helping to perhaps reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to improve soil structure, to make nutrients available to the following crop. And so if you were interested in just one of these functions, as Shaun's alluded to, then you might be better off growing a monoculture that could perform that function. But most people growing cover crops are interested in obtaining multiple different functions, and the likelihood is that there isn't an individual plant species that can perform that individual function to the greatest maximum effect. So for that reason, we grow mixtures. We try and kind of ensure that we're delivering all of these different functions at the same time. But there might also be some interactions between species, so that means that we get some kind of interaction that results in the sum being greater than the sum of the parts. And we're particularly interested in this question in terms of soil carbon storage. So if we've got a diverse mix of cover crops, then when we mix them together, do we get more carbon being stored in the soil than we would get if we were growing them as individual monocultures? So to start with, I want to talk a little bit about kind of soil organic matter and how organic matter or crop residues become soil organic matter. And there's been a bit of a revolution in soil science in the last 10 or so years in our understanding of this. And we used to think that soil organic matter was just dead plant material. And now our understanding is that a lot of the soil organic matter that we find in soils, particularly the stable soil organic matter, is actually dead microbes. So before it gets into the soil organic matter, it has to first pass through the microbes. And the microbes are mining the plant material that you add to the soil. They're releasing enzymes to break it down into smaller parts. They're assimilating it into their biomass. They're getting fat. The majority of that carbon is then respired as CO2 in the same way that when we eat, we respire and we release CO2. And sometimes when we eat, we get fat. We want our microbes to get fat. So a big sort of focus of my research has been trying to find agricultural practices that makes the microbes fat and respire a little bit less. So we want nice, big, fat, lazy microbes in our soil. So does diversifying our plant materials also result in more microbial biomass? And this is what we've been researching at the moment. So the way that we go about this and we think about mixtures is we think about there's different ways in which mixtures can interact. So an additive effect would mean that 1 + 1 = 2, for example. So this means that you don't get any true interaction. But we can also have non-additive effects. So that can be synergistic effects, where the sum is greater than the sum of the parts, or we can have antagonistic effects, where the sum is less than the sum of the parts. And we've been using this in terms of cover crops. So we've been looking at 4 different cover crops. So we've been looking at all radish, so buckwheat, clover and sunflower. And we've been looking at those as monocultures and also as diverse polycultures as well. And then we look at the average that the 4 monocultures provide, and then we compare that and see whether it is greater than or less than or equal to what happens when we grow all 4 plant materials together. And we started off in the lab because that's my natural habitat. And we were doing some pot experiments, and we managed to do some cool techniques in these pot experiments that enabled us to track every single molecule of carbon applied from that plant and tracked where it went in the soil plant system. So we ended up tracking it into the soil microbial biomass. And what we found, to cut a long story short, was that we found that there's more carbon stored in the microbial biomass when you apply residues from 4 different plants than you would expect based on the performance of the individual plants put together. And so everything in this experiment, exactly the same amount of carbon, was added into each treatment of this experiment. So this is some evidence to back up and support what I hear farmers telling me, which is that diverse mixtures of cover crops help improve soil health and increase soil organic matter levels. So it kind of works in the lab. We also had a field trial. And you can see the field trial is very, very kind of wet conditions there on one year when we got the drone up taking a photo of it. But it's a similar idea here. Here we were growing the mixture of 4 cover crops, either as individuals or as a mixture, every single summer between autumn sown cereal crops. And we were also fertilizing at a slightly lower rate than we would normally do because we were trying to recover some of the nitrogen of the previous crop. So it's like a catch crop, really, perhaps rather than an overwinter cover crop. And so 3 years after this field experiment, we went back and we analysed the soil organic matter in the soil. Unfortunately, though, it doesn't work in the field. We didn't see any effects due to the cover crops. Even the presence of cover crops compared to the absence of cover crops had no significant effect on the soil organic matter in the soil. And this is putting a cover crop in every single year, or every single summer, I should say, for 3 years in a row. So I guess that's the caution, that there may be some effects that we see in the lab, but when we take it out into the field, there's probably larger things at play. And in fact, whereas we can compare the average with the mixture might be slightly greater. Actually, the soil organic matter in our control treatment was higher than any other treatment, but as I say, not significant altogether. So we're still yet to find some good evidence of this working in the field. So just some take-home messages before I hand over to the next speaker. So in theory, diversity provides this kind of insurance against kind of failure. So you haven't got a single point of failure. That can be an establishment or in the performance of a function. So if you're interested in just performing one function, so for example, if you are interested in just preventing nitrogen leaching or preventing erosion, then it might be the case that a monoculture will perform that, and you're better off going with that as a cover crop. But if you want to perform multiple different functions, then the likelihood is that a bespoke mix that's designed to perform those functions is the best way to go. Also, when we think about synergism, so true interactions between cover crops, where the mixture is the sum of the parts, mixture is greater than the sum of the parts. We've got some evidence from the lab to show that those diverse mixtures of cover crops increase soil organic matter or increase microbial biomass at least, but we're still lacking evidence in the field to demonstrate that those cover crop mixtures are either better than the sum of the parts, or indeed in our experiment, better than having no cover crops at all. So I'll hand back to Shaun, I think, for the next one.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, I think we're going to take questions all at the end. So if you save your questions for discussion at the end. I'm going to hand over to Ian Gould. Ian is Director of Oakbank Game and Conservation Limited, who are well known for their work with farms and estates in habitat creation, woodland management, and more recently, regen ag. Ian has travelled extensively to speak to and learn from the best exponents of cover crops, including plant breeders, drill manufacturers, and many farmers. Ian and Oakbank are at the forefront of using all the tools available to farmers and land managers so that they can benefit from the new opportunities such as carbon, biodiversity net gain, and regenerative agriculture. Ian?
Thanks, Shaun. Good afternoon, everybody. I haven't got a presentation. I thought I'd try and build on what Tom was saying. And moreover on that insurance thing about whether multi-species mixes are the right thing or not. It's really crucial that before you start doing any cover cropping, you know what you're trying to achieve. So in certain circumstances, and biofumigation is one really crucial one, actually using a mixture can give you a much worse result than using a single species or a single type of crop. Because the effect that you're creating by using, say, a mustard would be undone by the other species in the mixture. So if you're biofumigating, say, potatoes or for sugar beet or something like that, be very careful about using multi-species if that's your objective. But I am fully on board the multi-species bus as a general principle. However, cover crops are a topic. They're not a thing. They're not just one sort of answer. So there are lots of different factors affecting your choice of what you're going to do. One of those is how long is this crop going to be in the ground for? So today we've had a lot of conversations on our stand about catch crops. So between a cereal being harvested at the beginning to the middle of August, before another cereal being planted at the beginning of October. So you might have 6 to 8 weeks. Now really there are only a few species that are really going to give you value for money grown in that slot, that are going to grow fast enough, do enough, and be worth spending the money on. But I would still encourage people to try and use 3 or 4 entirely different crop types to try and get this diversity of rooting. That's both the exudates, so that's the products that the roots are putting into the soil. I remember at college 30 years ago, all we spoke about roots was taking stuff out of the soil. But we really have started to understand how much they put back into the soil. And they tend to be carbon-rich products. Carbon is kind of the currency in the soil. And if you're looking for some sort of further material on this, there's an absolutely fantastic talk that you can get on YouTube from a company called Green Cover Seeds. And it's called Carbonomics. And it's the economics of carbon in the soil. I won't go into it now because it's an hour-long presentation, but it's absolutely brilliant at explaining why and how carbon works as the currency in the soil. But there are lots of different carbohydrate products that the different microorganisms use as trading materials. So they give one. The plant gives the carbon out, and the biodiversity, the biology gives something back in return for that. And the more diversity of products you've got going out, the more diversity you've got coming back in. And we've seen this really clearly in our work with companion crops and oilseed rape. So a lot of people are using one or two things, and we've been using 4 or 5 in some situations. And we discovered this by accident because, unlike Tom, I'm not a proper scientist, or I'm not a scientist at all. I'm a seeds guy. But when you're in the field, sometimes you notice stuff. And we had a 50-hectare field, and unfortunately the farmer ran out of the companion mix 4 hectares from the end. So there were 4 hectares of this field which didn't have the companion mix, but everything else that was done to that field was the same. The oilseed rape in the companion was fantastic. The oilseed rape outside of the companion was equally good at the outset. But as it went on into the winter, the agronomist noticed that although the plants were all there, the rape that didn't have the companion didn't look as healthy, didn't look as good. And so we did some sap analysis on those leaves, and that showed that there were lots of nutrients that had been accessed by the companion crop, which meant that the nutritional balance in the leaves of the oilseed rape was much better where the companion crop was compared to where it wasn't. And that was for things that hadn't been applied. So it was micronutrients, things like copper and zinc and so on, which hadn't been applied by the farmer. So the only place they could have come from was the interaction between the companion crop and the oilseed rape as compared to where it wasn't there. Now, on a lab test, it was really clear that that had happened. Unfortunately, when it came to the yield at the end of the day on the combine, there wasn't any statistical difference. But to be fair, everything that had been done to those 2 crops was the same. So it might be that we could maybe save some money on some nutrient, maybe we could save some money on some crop protection products, something like that. But it was a really interesting thing that we discovered. As I say, it was a bit of by accident, but sometimes those are the best discoveries. In terms of what Tom was saying about insurance, I'd agree completely. Some seasons you could put all your eggs in one basket, and it might be that there's an interaction between a herbicide that had been used on the previous crop and the crop that you chose to use as your cover crop, and it made it fail. So if you've got a broad spectrum of things in, that's going to really get you out of jail sometimes. But equally, the more knowledge we get about those interactions, we don't want to be spending money on things that are clearly going to fail at the outset. We want to be trying to use sensible combinations. So it is a developing science. It's a developing knowledge base from farmers. If any of you are interested in learning more from these sort of experiments, one of the best sources I know is the group called Base UK, which is the no-till farming group. They've got a stand at the show over the next couple of days. I urge you to join that. It's been a really key resource for learning. As we go forward, we're looking at ways of combining things by planting them before the crop is harvested to try and get a longer period of time for these crops to grow. But not all things will grow well broadcast. Physically, some seeds broadcast better than others. The hard, round ones spin perfectly to quite big distances. Other things like Phacelia and linseed, they don't spin very far at all, so they need drilling. Unfortunately, also, broadcasting complex mixtures is very difficult. Not all seeds like being planted on the surface. Some like to be planted under the surface, some quite deep. So there's all those issues as well. But honestly, as a principle, it's quite difficult standing on the stage with 4 white Anglo-Saxon blokes to talk about diversity. But, it really is definitely the way that we're getting results in the field. We're getting different types of architecture of the roots, which is mining different parts of the soil. We're getting better water infiltration by having nests of roots in the top and then vertical roots from things like linseed and obviously things like radishes. We're getting crops that are putting nitrogen and other nutrients into the soil, like the legumes. We're getting crops which are stopping nitrates and things that are already in the soil from leaching away. So it's very hard to get all of those elements from one species. So I'd urge you to try and use multi-species where you can, but as Tom alluded to, it's not always the right thing. Many of you might have come across Phil Jarvis, who used to be the farm manager at Loddington, and I always remember he said to me, the first thing he wanted his cover crop to do was keep the soil in the field it started in. And that's a perfectly reasonable objective. And you don't need a multi-species crop to do that. You just need something fast and with roots in the ground. But if you are trying to fix the biology, I'd urge you to look at multi-species. And I'll hand on to the next speaker. Right.
Lovely, thanks Ian. And finally, we've got Ian Waller. Ian is a first-generation farmer, tenant farmer at Hampton Bottom Farm at a 435-hectare farm on chalk and loam soils at 600 feet above sea level in the Chilterns area of outstanding natural beauty. The farm is a rotation of milling wheats, OSR and field beans with a flock of Herdwick sheep. A leaf demonstration farmer, Ian has received the Farmers Weekly Countryside Farmer of the Year Award, runner-up in the Silver Lapwing Award, and in 2020, a finalist in the Soil Farmer of the Year. So, over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Shaun, and you overdid it a bit there. Right, being a first-generation farmer, I think I have some really big advantages. I don't have anybody sort of looking over my shoulder and saying, that won't work, we can't afford to do it like that. It's very much up to me and sort of starts and stops with me. So I can understand where a lot of my colleagues and neighbours have some sort of serious restrictions there. So for me, diversity is everything. And yes, I have my own sheep, but I also bring other people's sheep onto my farm to graze my overwinter cover crops that are preceding spring beans. And Ian has sort of mentioned how I go about establishing mine in that I'm passionate about not tilling the soil, so all my cover crops are established by broadcasting. I'm lucky enough to have a 24-metre wing jet, so nothing's really thrown very far, which is where you get the split up of heavy and light seeds. So we blow everything on into standing crop. So I've got a 24-metre drill, if you like, that uses very little diesel and certainly has no steel engagement in the soil to plant those seeds. But there's lots of buts. Ian did allude slightly to potential herbicide damage in certain parts of the mixture. I'm basis qualified, although I don't do my own agronomy on my own. I employ an independent, but we sort of come at it from two different angles and have a fair debate about what we do. So the things I avoid that will damage my cover crops are things like DFF in the previous autumn. It's got massive half-life, and I'm sure you've all seen it on cleavers bleaching the leaves the following summer. So, no DFF anywhere in my arable system. So that's one big thing. And the second big thing is most of the SUs in the spring will have a fair carryover. So the likes of Ali, Buddha, Atlantis are all avoided because of the damage they'll potentially do going forward in my broadcasted cover crop. But there are alternatives. We're not in an advertising campaign here, but certainly I still use Starain and on cleavers, and I would use something called Hiatus, which is an SU, but has an incredibly short half-life. So thinking outside the box and looking at what's out there, you can solve your broadleaf weed problems in your preceding crop to then allow your cover crop to establish. And the key thing about getting it established in a standing crop of wheat is that every day of light or sunshine, once you've got the previous crop off, is extremely valued. So the few weeks that you might have between combining at the end of September, say, and starting drilling at the beginning of October, I've extended that into, I'll be broadcasting in the next 2 weeks. So straight away, I've got a 4-week uplift on what I'm going to get established. But you can come unstuck. I do wait sometimes for wet weather. We've had no real rain where we are in the Chilterns for probably the best part of a month now. But I will try and time it, so if there's a bit of moisture about, we'll go for it. But sometimes even a week after rain, you can still get those quite dewy mornings where the moisture is getting lifted. And with certain species in the cover crop mix, that will be enough to get them going. Much as I have tried growing and through my own failure, I've learned that certain things don't work, but it's not just one try. I try it over several years. So vetches I'd love to have in my mix, but they don't suit my application method. Great if you're drilling, but I'm too busy combining to get off the combine onto the drill. And if I am going to get on a drill, it'll be to drill oilseed rape, which I have tried by broadcasting as a with a companion crop, and sometimes that fails, sometimes it succeeds. So if I'm going to do that, I tend to use home saved seed, and if it works, it works, and if it doesn't, we turn around and start drilling as soon as the combine's out the field. So, but that's quite difficult because I drive the drill and the combine. So, but the mixtures I tend to end up establishing two main sort of categories: what I'm trying to achieve, which is A, diversity of mix; B, is it going to be a wheat following wheat into second wheat, for instance? So that will have all fairly fast-growing things. So I'll have in there conventional spring oats, black oats, oil and tillage radish, linseed, phacelia, berseem clover, and things I've tried to sort of incorporate into that mix would be something like crimson clover. It looks really spectacular when it's flowering. Never quite makes it in that time frame. So ditch that. Don't try with that. Tried growing it in standing crop of beans, but generally there's not enough light in the beans to get that clover going. So keep trying. And some years some things work, some years some things don't. But I keep a book of each year of what my mixture's been, my drilling or sowing date on the surface, what sort of rain it's had after it, and what the outcome at the end is. And then my other mixture really is a winter cover crop, which would be, again, broadcast, and that would be, would have turnips in the mix. It would have winter oats instead of spring oats in there. Still have phacelia in there. Only 1 kilo mustard is all I ever put into either of those mixes because it becomes too dominant, and it's a bit of a club loop carrier and that sort of thing. So I tend to avoid something too cheap and too cheerful. So going back to that grazed crop, so I'd have tillage radish, oil radish, and a good dose of stubble turnips, and say winter oats, because the spring oats will be all right, but they will run to head, which the sheep will eat, but they will start keeling over when you start getting cold weather. I still include buckwheat in both those mixes, even though I know I'm going to lose them the first sign of some cold weather. So, but I still think that brings something to the party, even though it's only a short appearance. And you never stop learning. Every day is a school day. Saying that, and not every year everything works, but that diversity, you're always covering all the bases. And so a lot of people quite often make the comment, oh, it's all right for you, you've got livestock, you've got sheep coming on the farm, we haven't got that. No, you've all got livestock. You might not be able to see it because it might be fungi and bacteria in the soil, might be insects in those cover crops feeding on the pollen and nectar that's there, but never overlook those small species. It's not about four-legged things that want to get out. It's about big things, big numbers of things that you can attract onto your field through flowering and the pollinators, and the things you've already got there that will really benefit from that new root growth and build the biomass of fungi and bacteria that you're providing that host crop of diverse plants in what would be normally a monoculture wheat scenario, or obviously rape or beans. So that's my sort of take-home message to you. Really, is never stop trying different things. Might not work one year, but try it another year. And the other big thing is never spend too much money on it, because if it fails, it's not too big a disaster financially. I mix my own mixes, and so I can constantly adjust them. If you're not confident to do that, you obviously got to go to someone like Ian and get them to mix and advise you on what might suit your land type. And different things happen in different places, even on the same year, with different soil types within a field. So by having that diversity, you've always got quite a few different 4 or 5 things there that are really going to flourish, and occasionally that one thing that might not flourish on that soil type, or that whether it might even be in just a wheel mark, it might not flourish, but next door, a metre away, it could be really going great guns. So never give up, keep trying different things.
Well, give all 3 speakers a round of applause. Yeah, thank you. I think that was three interesting different perspectives on cover crop mixes from the sort of academic viewpoint, advisor's viewpoint, and the farmer's viewpoint. So hopefully there was some take-home messages there for you all. We've still got plenty of time, so we're happy to sort of take any questions you've got from the floor, and I think we've got a roving mic. So yeah, there's okay. Sorry, one question over here.
So where's the best? Where do we go to get this information about companion cropping and what mixes do what? And the $1 million question is, what was your companion cropping for the oilseed rape? What was
the species that we're using?
Yeah.
It depends a little bit on what else is in the rotation, but generally we've been using just to cover what the principle. Initially, the principles that we were using for companion crops were to try and beat cabbage stem flea beetle. There's a sort of theory that's come from France and some French work, which is that flea beetle find oilseed rape through a mixture of colour and smell. So that we were trying to make rape crops not look like rape crops and not smell like rape crops. And smell to an insect is basically the volatile chemicals that are coming off the leaves. So we were using buckwheat, which was there because it grows very fast. It's what I call a sipper of a crop. It uses very little water. It'll grow in extremely dry conditions, and it'll grow very, very, very quickly. So you can plant it at the same time as the rape, and it should grow faster than the rape. We're then using berseem clover, and we favour a variety called tabor, which is it's called a single cut, so it doesn't become a problem later on. It's nearly always winter killed. And that roots very fast. And the theory, again, is that the roots of the rapeseed follow the roots of the tabor berseem clover down, and it helps it access a bigger area of soil, more water, more nutrients, and so on. We're using vetch sometimes, which is helping to feed the crop long term. And we're using fenugreek, which is also known as the curry plant, and that's this disguising the smell. And I know that's also a legume, so it's fixing nitrogen later as well. The nice thing about things like fenugreek, berseem clover, and oilseed rape is that they're very, very similar sizes. So if you haven't got a drill with separate hoppers, those things will mix very happily, and you can be pretty confident that the oilseed rape is going to drill at the right rate. When you start adding some other things like buckwheat, with some types of drill, that can be a bit problematic. So it's crucial with all crops that the cash crop is drilled accurately. So that's sometimes why we might leave some elements out. But when we're using drills like the Sky Easy drill, it's got multiple hoppers, we can split the things up, we can be confident that the rape's going at the right rate and the companion crop's going at the right rate. We sometimes use Phacelia, although that does worry some agronomists that it's hard to kill in oilseed rape. And we've got other people using a little bit of linseed and even things like sunflowers to add that diversity and that distraction. But the main ones we would use would be buckwheat, berseem clover, and fenugreek would be the typical, and then vetch probably next.
And is there a source of information for similar, as you've just explained for oilseed rape? Is there a sort of a go-to source for other crops?
I would personally recommend joining a group like BASE because other farmers are currently the best source of information for how they're getting on in different scenarios. Academically, people like Tom are doing a lot of work in this space, but it does take time to, get things peer reviewed and so on. And it's a rapidly developing space, and the farmer to farmer peer networking is probably the best place to get information quickly.
Thank you.
Okay, Simon?
Do you count your worms? Sorry, yeah. Sorry. Do you count your worms at all, and is there any differences between different cover crops, and what do you see the benefits potentially?
Randomly I count them, but I'm quite good at coming out with sayings, and generally you can put a spade in the ground on any of my fields and you'd have 2 or 3 worms there. So quick calculation, sort of, I employ 1 man and 200 million worms, and you won't know, but I'm passionate about looking after them because they will work 24 hours a day. and all those things. And they're really they're like the whales in the ocean, so they're the big workers moving a lot of stuff deep down into the soil. But they do want a great deal of respect. So I take it as far as I won't actually take a tractor and trailer on the field when we're combining. I unload on the headland tram line, because the only thing that goes across the field is the combine and a drill or the pneumatic spreader in the tram lines. So they are the key workers, definitely, and you ignore those at your peril, really. And I know you're from a water company, so infiltration, they're the key workers on that. So there are so many levels, but all they really require is plenty of trash, and a living root in the ground soon becomes trash for them, and they'll adopt those. Certainly, the tap roots from oil radish will certainly soon, fairly soon through the winter, be taken over by deep burrowing earthworms. So they're definitely a big thing. Some I don't know about some of the fumigation type plants, whether they'd sort of not kill them necessarily, but make them less, encourage them less to start working as well as they do. Certainly in some of my soils, but it's like a lot of this stuff we're looking at here at Grounsdwell. Nothing is a quick fix overnight. It all takes time, but you do need the guidance. And I will reiterate what Ian says. We're both on the base committee, so there is information out there from knowledge exchange, from experience, from farmers, and it's not someone trying to sell you some magic potion to sort of fix a problem that's not really there. No.
Can I just add to that as well? I'd say when you're looking for your worms, you also want to be looking at the types that you've got, not just how many. So that you mentioned deep burrowing earthworms, and you'll be able to spot that because you'll see the residues clustered together across the field. And then if you put the spade in, you'll see some smaller earthworms, and these are the ones that kind of moving horizontally and moving it around. And so the deep burrowing ones are improving the drainage, but then the ones that are horizontal burrowing are kind of just reducing the strength and the compaction of the soil in general. So it will make it easier for plant roots to then push through that soil. So you kind of want to check to see if you've got both types present. And the deep burrowing ones are the ones that disappear due to ploughing or tillage most easily.
Yeah, I've certainly noticed at home on the earthworm front that numbers have definitely built over the years. A couple of years ago we did have a really dry spring and summer, not dissimilar to now, and we lost a lot of the deep burrows. But I was really pleased to see when it did rain in August while we were combining, within a week there was loads of little earthwormlings, tiny little things that were there to replace them. They obviously got their own system. They know if they're going to die, and within a drought they'll lay masses of eggs in the surface that will sit there and wait for rain. So the other thing I didn't really mention, which is sort of probably key to my farming practice, is I've been zero on insecticides for the last 7 years, and that really enhances that biodiversity of parasitic wasps and predators. And I'm the only person left in my agricultural association growing oilseed rape, which is from 15 or 16 a few years ago.
Just one thing that actually made me quite sad. I was at a meeting that was held by a company that were talking all about soil carbon. So you would imagine that all the farmers that attended that meeting were quite switched on about soil carbon and about soil generally. And I asked how many of them carried a spade around in their truck, and almost none of them did. And they were all spending a lot of money getting expensive soil tests done and so on and so forth. I'm not for a second saying that they have no value at all, because they definitely do. But looking for yourself with a spade on your farm will tell you a hell of a lot more, much more quickly than sampling will do all of the time, and it'll save you a lot of money. And do it before you start a project or changing anything. Have a look, count some worms, take some pictures of the colour of your soil when you start, because you need to know where you started from to know if you've gone anywhere. But there's lots of really good evidence that simple measures like counting earthworms will tell you quite a lot about if you're changing anything, if you're achieving anything. And I would really add a note of caution that numbers on a test on a day in a year tell you something about that day. What you need is a trend over time. Are you going the direction you want to go? Because that's what you need, not a number on a day. That's what worries me a little bit about some of the carbon stuff that's talked about. I know we've spoken about this before, but it's over time. You've got to see these changes over time. And honestly, simple things like counting earthworms will tell you quite a lot. and it costs you nothing other than a bit of time and a sore back sometimes if you choose a bad day to be digging holes.
I will quickly say while you're changing over that I don't carry a spade, I carry a fork. We've got too many stones. And a fork works really well, when I lift the fork up, most of the soil doesn't make it to the surface. I don't actually end up with a hole. It fragments and falls through the fork. Well, 20 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. And, you know, I've charted that at the time I've been a tenant there on my journey. And a spade or a fork is invaluable. It's the best piece of investment you'll ever make.
Okay.
So for probably both Ians, but I was just wondering, is broadcasting the best way to ensure success with catch crops? So for the ones that you're going to follow up in the autumn? And Ian, I just wondered about, when you said about measuring success of your covers, how are you doing that? Is that just establishment of which ones are doing it, or are you doing anything else?
Yeah, you've really got to watch the weather, but if I physically have not got the time when I only employ one man and farm best part of 1,800 acres, because I look after sort of 3 other farms apart from my own, and all the other things I'm involved in. I'm not doing that much in the summer, admittedly, apart from driving a combine, but I physically cannot turn around and drill it, even though I've got an 8-metre drill sitting on the tractor ready to go. The days I gain for the amount of loss I have from poor establishment, don't even equate. There's no point even worrying about it. Yes, I lose some poor germination if it came dry, but in general, most of those seeds will grow, and that's why, much as I love vetch, it doesn't fit that system. I did grow beans one year as a companion crop in rape, and I broadcast those, and they grew on the surface. They grow when they fall out the back of the combine. So why aren't they going to grow? Buckwheats, we've already mentioned, really big seed, but establishes really, really well. Don't matter how dry it is, that will always establish. And generally with the brassicas, the smaller they are, the better they establish. But then to buck that trend, I think oil radish establishes really well for a big brassica, and it delivers really quick. That'll have, it's not easy digging on my land with the stone content on top of the Chilterns, but I've dug down over a metre. In 10 weeks, that root's still going strong over a metre, and the biomass at the top. So generally, you'll get what you get on top below, but some of that might not go straight down, it might go straight out. So don't necessarily just go for depth. That diversity of rooting is laterally as well as at depth. So diversity on top, diversity in the ground is everything. And yeah, I won't say my book's the Bible about what I can and can't do, but you've got to take into account what the weather's done as to how successful you've been. Shiny seed like linseed will establish, but it just takes a bit longer. But because it's got that bit of extra time, it is still far better than drilling it. So
you also have to take into account the context that we're talking about. Ian's soil is in incredibly good shape, and that doesn't half help. Now, if you're on a sliding scale of luck to skill, drilling is here, all right? Drill it well, it will nearly always grow. Broadcasting is way over here, okay? There's a lot of luck involved in broadcasting. I've broadcast with a similar system to one Ian's using into what I considered were really good optimal conditions to make it work, and it hasn't worked. The other element of that is good crops follow good crops. And if you've got a good, even cover crop across the whole field, your next crop is probably going to be good and even across the whole field. If broadcasting means you've got patchy establishment and patchy emergence and patchy cover, it's going to affect your next crop as well. So I completely understand the timeliness is really key, and doing it Ian's way or not doing it, which is the alternative in your scenario, it's the right way to go. In a perfect world, I would always drill my cover crops. You just get far better even take if you can. But is it better than not doing it? Absolutely it is. But you are compromising the choice of things you could use which are likely to be successful, and you're probably having to use more seed because the germination is going to be less. So what you're saving on drilling, you're spending on seed, but it's probably still cheaper to broadcast it for sure. I'm sure of that. But you're definitely compromising the things that are likely to work in that situation.
So taking you back a few steps. So when I first started broadcasting, it was mainly just turnips, and I could get it wrong and end up with turnips sort of way above cutter bar height, and end up getting the tops of turnips in the combine. But it looked pretty horrible, but it wasn't a big disaster. And then to move on from there to start with the different seed mixtures to see what would work, I made loads of little bits of little flags up with tape and on MIG wire, and put little heaps of little scatterings of seed in 6-inch squares on the ground with canes in a standing crop. And none of them seemed to establish particularly well. And in fact, they all disappeared. But what was happening was field mice were coming out the margin and eating my seed that was laid on the surface. So straight away, you think you're doing the right thing by going a bit tentatively into this. But on a field scale, that's no big issue. But doing a little trial on the edge of a margin was an absolute disaster and could have completely put me off. But I worked out what was happening, why it wasn't working, and went from there. But thanks to Ian for saying my soils are in good condition. Yeah, I overlook how good my soil is, perhaps because when I started there 20 years ago, a Grounsdwell plough would ride out the ground in August, and you had to wait for a decent amount of rain. And then when you did turn it over, it was in slabs the size of the chairs you're sitting on, and job to break it down. And I started my min-till journey as a share farmer, but now I can kick a hole in the field with my bare boot, 6 inches deep, virtually any time of the year. It just doesn't go tight like it used to go tight. But that's overlooking the soil armour. We've talked about stopping each raindrop hitting the ground at 30 miles an hour. It's a tremendous amount of damage for the soil. If you can stop that and make sure it hits a plant, you're part way there.
Any other questions? Okay, one just here. If you just wait for the microphone.
I think I can.
Okay.
Maybe you have some companion crops or all seed rape because of slugs, like to attract them, like you said about flies.
My sort of position on slugs is if you're worrying about slugs, you've already got the problem. It's what's going to make it worse or what's going to help. I don't think any of the species that I've been using, certainly slugs were not a particular consideration. It was all about flea beetle and getting the crop established. One thing that, taking all of these practices into account, is if you are making your general soil health better, you're probably creating conditions that will help you to counteract slugs in other ways, because we're trying to use less insecticides, and that includes slug pellets for sure. But we haven't been trying to use companions to beat slugs. It's not an issue. I have to say, using cover crop mixtures, the one species I found slugs don't seem to eat is Phacelia. Has anyone had different experience of that? It seems to be unpalatable, not touched. It's reliable. It doesn't like broadcasting very much. Is that your experience? You've been all right? Yeah, good. Generally, it's thought it needs to be in the dark to germinate, but that's one species that slugs really don't like. But it's also difficult to kill in oilseed rape with typical herbicides. You sometimes have to spend more money to get rid of it, and even then it can be difficult. So that's our experience. We haven't really been targeting them. I know with some people they're trying other systems for some pests, like putting trap crops around the edge of the fields near the grass margins and so on, where some of these predators come out from. But we've yet to look at that, to be honest. Have you any experience, Tom?
I was going to say, what's good for slugs is also good for worms, but the worms will multiply slower. So you might have a slug problem to start with, but once you get the rest of the biology moving and the worms going, they'll be bringing some of that trash off of the surface. So there won't be anything for the slugs to eat. So I guess the trash that you leave on your field is probably gone by October, November, right? Because you've got the worms bringing it down. And there's nothing then for the slugs to eat over the winter.
Yeah, that certainly varies with different years and different scenarios. And I've just said about worms dying in really dry weather. But yeah, I do have a bit of an issue with slugs, and I've been under pressure a long time because I am slightly connected with Affinity over metaldehyde when we still had that. And it was a good product in that we could see what it did, but it was a disastrous product as far as water quality was concerned. So I've been on ferric for quite a long time, and it is quite difficult because you don't see the dead slugs on the surface to know what your results are. So slug trapping, it becomes a priority with that. But I'd like to think there are plenty of things out there in a really healthy soil that will sort of counteract the slugs in a way. I don't know what they are, but a problem of any species generally in a crop is because we've done something wrong, and we've been messing it up for a long time. And I think we're in a really interesting place at the moment for the last perhaps 10 years trying to put things right and go in the right direction. It's just that the information and guidance that are out there is not that clear, and it doesn't always work in a field as well as it works in a lab. And we're out there on our own in that instance, apart from where we're sort of knowledge exchanging with fellow farmers.
Okay, yeah, question over here.
Going on from Ian Gould's point there, are there any species in your mixes, especially catch crop mixes, that give you greater headaches in the following crop because they've gone to seed?
Hopefully not, because we try and avoid them. It's like many things. You try and avoid problems, and my first principle is do no harm. So it's a bit like using things in the rotation which might come and bite you back later on. And I have to credit people like PGRO who do some really interesting work on how cover crops affect things like vining peas, and that work's crucial. And I applaud them for doing it and sharing the information. But certain things, I'll give you some examples of where I'm careful. I tend not to use buckwheat immediately before sugar beet, because buckwheat is a polygonum, and my agronomy friends tell me polygonums can be quite difficult to control in sugar beet. Some of the work PGRO have done suggests that some legumes don't seem to cause any problems before vining peas, but bizarrely radishes do, which seems odd that the same family doesn't cause a problem, but another family can. But this is a developing space, certainly, in terms of things that we're learning. What else wouldn't I use? Obviously, your opportunity for producing seed depends somewhat on when you plant it. And chemicals are not the only way of stopping that happening. We sometimes use a set of Cambridge rolls, not necessarily to kill the crop, but sometimes to knock the seed out. So we had some situations 3 years ago where if you probably remember, the winter was horribly wet and then the spring was horribly wet, and this field, which was destined for spring wheat, got planted with a summer cover crop that was absolutely amazing. It was full of flowers and then full of seeds in July, August. And what we did was we actually rolled it with a set of Cambridge rolls, which knocked all of the seed that had been produced out. It killed some of the species, but left things like crimson clover and things alive. But what it also did was all those seeds which were viable and were knocked out then produced another seed. They produced another cover crop in the field. So you got two lots of cover crop for one planting. So I like to think we turned a problem into an opportunity. But certainly there are some things that you need to think about the timing of when your cover crop's in the ground. In terms of catch crops, probably the fastest growing one is something like a mustard and sometimes buckwheat. There are definitely varietal differences in some that flower and seed more quickly. But I'll give you an example of where that's an opportunity as well as a problem. So with buckwheat, there's some evidence that it's useful for predatory wasps. So what you want to do is when you plant it, you want the flowers to come as quickly as possible. But unfortunately, if the flowers come as quickly as possible, the seeds come really quickly as well. So depending on what you're trying to do, you might want a later flowering variety or you might want an earlier one. But it's just understanding the real context. And that's why I said earlier, standing at the microphone, context of what you're trying to do and getting some advice from someone who's done a fair bit of it. And that might well be a farmer rather than a seed merchant, is really important. But we're learning, and as I say, the peer-to-peer learning is getting this stuff done much more quickly, because we have some resources that we put into R&D, but if farmers are sharing knowledge with each other, we'll get along a lot faster.
As much as I'm fairly gung-ho with what I do in the field, occasionally you get little warning signs, and then Ian's occasionally said you do have to be careful where you're buying certain things from, because I buy mostly straights, and that's probably highlighted in a not disastrous way, but my Berseem clover isn't the variety which Ian mentioned. I'd use something a bit cheaper, but I noticed the other day when I was putting some nitrogen on my rape, there's probably in a 5 hectare field, there's about 20 beautiful vetch plants sticking out the top, beautiful purple flowers on them, covered in bees, but that must have come in with the Berseem clover. So nothing's ever as pure as you think. So sometimes you might end up with something you don't really want, and I can't tell you what that might be just off the top of my head, but just be a bit careful with what you're getting and where it's from, and make sure it is from a sort of reputable source, because you might end up with something you don't really want at all.
Okay, we've got 5 minutes left. Probably time for one last question, if anyone's got one. Okay, one more here.
What's if you're putting your field to like a break crop, what's a really good cover crop that would last for a year, or a mixture?
Again, you need to think slightly about what went before and what's coming after. But we've seen some which Shaun's seen near Royston. There are some species which are much more winter hardy than others. So for the experience that we've had with this crop near Royston, things that have done well, obviously some of the cereals would be good. So your oats are quite good, or rye, or even triticale perhaps. The vetch that you can be pretty confident is going to survive through the winter and come out the other side is hairy vetch. It's one of the ones that does the least. It's the least exciting before Christmas, but if you leave it long enough into when the spring warms up, my God, it grows, doesn't it? I mean, it's just amazing. Phacelia seems pretty robust. If it grows, it's funny, if it grows too much before Christmas and you get a hard frost, a lot of it will die. The smaller plants seem to be more tolerant of the frost. Some of the clovers, like crimson clover, would be good. What else could you use? Some of the brassicas, like a forage rape. You could plant a forage rape in the autumn, and it would flower and seed in the spring, but it would still provide some useful services in that situation. Trying to think what else we saw in there. There's probably not too much. All of the clovers, like red clover, white clover, all-site clover, all those sorts of things would work, but they're quite expensive. So we're contributing quite a lot to the conversations on the SFI project, and I really hope government are listening, because some of the stuff they're coming out with is really not helpful, and it wasn't helpful when they did it in the EFAs, and it's not going to be helpful again if they go the way they're going at the moment. And I'm not talking about the money, I'm talking about the rules. So, please, government, talk to people who are doing it, not people who are just talking about it. Because done right, SFI could be great. Done wrong, we will waste all the money, which would be a crying shame. But I would love to see an annual cover crop option in elms. I would love to. We're currently using the nectar flower mix in a similar way. It's not really what it's intended for, but it can be done. It's just a little bit tricky. But that option, I think, would be very popular, and it would work very well, deliver a lot of benefits.
Brilliant. Well, thank you to our 3 speakers. Thanks for attending. I think we'll finish with one more round of applause. And,